Okay, so with that background, let us begin the Mishnah. Kira, an oven, like I described, a rectangular shaped oven, which is the Bartanur, it says is normally set into the ground. The source of fuel is inside the oven and there's room on the top for two pots. Shehisikuha bekash uvagvava. It has been fueled with straw and with stubble. Now straw and stubble are not going to make the oven particularly hot. And more than that, they're going to be consumed very quickly. So for these fuels, Chazal were not worried that you may come to stoke because there's nothing left. It burns so quickly, they don't create coal, and we're not worried that you might come to stoke things later on. Therefore, says the Mishnah, Noisnin Oleha Tafshel, you can put food onto the pot without any problem. By gefes uva eitzim, if however the fuel for the oven is gefes or eitzim, the Bartanura says gefes. Says the Bartanura, gefes is the residue of the pesoile shel zeisim v'shumshumin. It's the residue of olives and of sesame. La'acha shehutziu shamnon. After you've taken the oil out of them, then using those sort of pits of the olives and of the sesame to put into the oven, that is different because that gets very hot. That's a very strong source of fuel. It says the Mishnah, Lo yitein ad sheyigroif ayat sheyitein esoefer. Now there, we're worried that if you were to leave the pot on top of the stove and its fuel inside is gefes or is eitzim or wood, both of those two things could become coal, and therefore we're worried shem yechter. You might come to stoke it and be over the issa of kindling on Shabbos. So therefore the Mishnah says, if the source of fuel is gefes or eitzim, which is the residue of pits of olives or of sesame or of wood, lo yitein ad sheyigrof. You mustn't place something on the stove or leave something on the stove, shehiyah-wise, ad sheyigrof, until you've removed all the coals from inside the kira, or until you've put some ash on top of the coals. How does that help? Because once you've done that sort of heka, that sort of reminder, Chazal are no longer worried that you might come to stoke the flames. So therefore the Mishnah says, if your kira, your oven, has been fueled by kash or guvava, by straw and stubble, we're not worried. No problem of shehiyah. If, however, it's been fueled with gefes or eitzim, which can generate a lot of heat, and which could become coals, and there's a chashash, there is a concern, maybe you'll stoke the coals, then lo yitein, you're not allowed to leave things on the oven at sheyigref or at sheyitin soifa until you've either removed the coals. According to most Rishonim, it means you've removed all the coals. According to the Ran and the Balamar, it means you push them to one side. Or you do a different heka, sheyitin soifa. If you place ash on top of the coals, that, the Baratunur explains, you're going to cover them up, so you're covering the actual source of heat, and you're cooling them down. And the time of Gzer Shem Yechter b'Kacholim. The whole concern is that you might stoke the flames. Kadei lemaheh b'shulei. And therefore we're not concerned in this situation. Now, the Bartanura goes on and explains that in Dibah HaMaschil, Oishe Yitein Ha'efa, the Bartanura says, V'dafka b'tavshil shelo bishul kol tzarcho. When are we worried? Specifically for a tavshil which is not fully cooked. Oyafilu bishul kol tzarcho, or even if it is fully cooked, stomach v'yofalei, if it would improve if you leave it further. Then who the gazrin and shemeyechte? In that scenario, then we're worried maybe a person would stoke the coals. Avol tavshil shelo bishul klal, but a pot of food which hasn't cooked at all, it's raw. Bishul kol tzarcho mistamik v'ralo, but further for cooking, it's actually fully cooked, but further cooking is going to be detrimental to it. That would be mutter to do shehiyah on top of a kir, on top of this type of oven. Even though you haven't taken away all the coal, or you haven't put some ash on top of it. In that scenario, we wouldn't be worried because we've set our mind away from it. We're not worried about it anymore. Our mind is not on it anymore. We've put it out of our minds. Similarly, v'chein tavshil shabishul kol tzarcho, says the Bartanura. Similarly, a food which has been cooked fully, v'hishlich b'soicha evechai, where you put a piece of raw meat into it, Samach lebein hashmoshes, close to bein hashmoshes, to shkia time on Friday afternoon. Naaseh hakol katav sheshal bishul kal. That has got now the status of food item which has not been cooked at all. Shahar hisiach item imenu. Even if you were to come and stoke it, given that the food is raw, you've got a big piece of raw meat in there, we're now not choshesh that you're going to come and stoke it. So then shahiyah would not be a concern. Okay. I'll continue the Mishnah, and then we'll discuss that this interpretation of the Mishnah only goes according to one opinion in the Gemara, and we'll explain the second opinion afterwards. But let's just finish off the Mishnah first. Beis Shammai Omru. Beis Shammai are of the opinion, Chamin avalo tavshel. This halacha of shehiyah applies to chamin, that when we said that gefes and eitzim, the oven is cooked, is fueled with gefes and with eitzim, then there is an eitzah to do gruf of ktuma, to actually yigrif achitnes or efer. There, that is only true for chamin. Avalo tavshel. But if the pot on top of this oven contains food, then gruf, garf, and cotton won't help you. It only helps you for regarding chamin. That's what Beis Shammai says. Beis Hillel omrim. Beis Hillel say no, chamin v'tavshel, that it would help you both for liquids, for hot water, and for tavshel and for food. So long as you do garf, you actually take away the coal, or you do cotton, you actually put some ash on the coals, then it would apply. Then it would be fine. Furthermore, Beis Shammai omrim notlin avalo machzirin. The last bit of the Mishnah, according to this opinion, is Beis Shammai omrim notlin avalo machzirin. You're allowed to take food off the oven on Shabbos, in the conditions that we've said. Avalo machzirin, but you mustn't put something back onto it. That is the issa of chazara that we mentioned before. To put something back onto the oven on Shabbos is a problem midrabanan because it looks like you're cooking it. And Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai will say you're never allowed to do that. Or Beis Hillel omrim af machazirin. You are allowed to do chazara on Shabbos. What does that mean? That so long as it's garf v'kotzim, which we mentioned earlier in the Mishnah, you would be allowed to do chazara. And that is a maisin b'chol yom, that chazara on Shabbos, putting food back onto a hot plate or the like on Shabbos, is permissible, but only under certain circumstances. The Gemara explains that, and the poskim certainly explain, that there seem to be 5 conditions. Again, it's a big machlokes, a massive discussion, but in absolute shortness and brevity, the halachas are as follows. L'moshel, in my home, together with my wife and the children in the winter, it's a very common scenario. We could eat, let's say at 4 or 5 o'clock on a winter Friday night, and let's say later in the evening, 9, 10 o'clock, the kids, we want to sit down and have some chulent. So how can we do that? So if you know the halachas of chazara, then it's permissible. What are the 5 conditions? I make the kids rattle the conditions off before they take the chulent. We go into the kitchen, and the chulent is cooking on a crock pot. So the first condition is that it's garif for cotton. We pass like Beis Hillel. So long as the source of heat is garif for cotton, then it's okay. Now, garif for cotton in the Mishnaic times are that you've actually removed the coals, or you've put ash on top of the coals, so there's a heka that you're not going to stoke the coals. In modern parlance, there's a big discussion what exactly is garif for cotton, and it depends very much on the type of instrument that we're talking about. But for a crock pot, for example, many poskim say that it would be sufficient to line the inside of the crock pot, which is on which the pot is resting, to line that with tin foil. That is considered like to be garif for cotton. That's enough of a heka that you've actually you've addressed the actual heat item element itself. Some poskim say that you need to raise it a little bit, but that's garif for cotton. That's the first condition. The second condition is that it's mevushal kol tzarcha, that it's fully cooked. If it's not fully cooked and you're taking some off and then you're putting it back, you're going to cook on Shabbos. So if it's garif for cotton and mevushal kol tzarcha, those are the first 2 conditions. Condition number 3 is that it's odo beyodo, that when you take it out, you actually have got to hold on to it still. You can't just let it down and leave it. It's got to be odo beyodo. That's third condition. The 4th condition is odo cham, it's still warm. It hasn't cooled down. And lastly, the 5th condition is daiti lachziro, that you have in mind to place it back. That's in short the 5 conditions. So long as you fulfill all of those, then lechatchila it'd be okay to take some chulent on Friday night, so long as it's garif v'kotzim, mevushal kol tzarcho, odo b'yodo, you're still holding onto it and serving it, and odo cham, and daiti lachziro, then you'd be allowed to take the lechatchila and then put it back on. Okay, so that is the Mishnah That is the Mishnah according to the first opinion in the Gemara. Now, very briefly, the Gemara presents famously a second interpretation of this Mishnah. That is the interpretation of Chananya. There is a well-known machlokus here in Perek Kira and Shabbos between the Rabbanan and Chananya, and really the machlokus revolves around how to interpret this Mishnah. Now, the reason why I mention this machlokus is because it's not in just a machlokus in the Gemara, it's a machlokus Rishonim who we paskin like. Do we paskin like the Rabbanan's interpretation of the Mishnah or Chananya's interpretation of the Mishnah? And in turn, this has major halachic significance nowadays, because the Mechaber paskins like the Rambam and the Rif and others who follow the Rabbanan's interpretation of the Mishnah, but the Ramah paskins like Rashi and Tosfos who follows Chananya's interpretation of the Mishnah. So what I'm going to do is very briefly is just to read from the Kahati at the end of this first Mishnah. He just explains how the Chananya would explain our Mishnah. So reading from the Kahati, he says like this: Avol Rashi v'Tosfos mefarshim Mishnoseinu b'derech acheres. Rashi and Tosfos interpret our Mishnah in a different way. Shekein nadaiton halachi kechananya. The halach is like Chananya, who says the following in the Brisa, which is brought in the Gemara: Kol shehu k'maichel ben drusoi. So long as the food is maichel ben drusoi, i.e., has been heated up to either a half cooked or a third cooked, mutter lahashhosa al gabe kira. It's mutter to leave it there on the kira. Afal pisha ina grufa ve'ina katuma. If the food is maichel ben drusoi according to Chananya, we don't need the oven to be garif v'kotum. And therefore Chananya interprets the Reisha, the beginning of our Mishnah. The Reisha of the Mishnah according to Chananya is not talking about Shehiyah like the Rabbanan learned, but is talking about Chazara. This is Pshat in the Mishnah according to Chananya. An akira, this rectangular oven with with room for two pots on it, which has been fired up with kash and with gvava, with straw and stubble. Machazirin oleho tavshel b'Shabbos. You're allowed to put food back onto that on Shabbos. No problem. But gefes over eitzim, if however it's been fueled up with gefes and with eitzim, with olive refuse and sesame refuse, over eitzim and with wood, lo yachazir, you mustn't put food items back because of the issue of chazara, until you have removed all the coals, or according to the Ran, you push them to the side, or you've done ketuma, which means you put the ash on top of the coals. V'chan yesh lehosif a mishnah. Avalishos, that's all vis-a-vis chazara. But to do shehiyah, meshahen, you can do that. Afa pish ena grufa ve'ena ketuma. That doesn't need grufa v'ketuma. Shehiyah, according to Chananya, does not need grufa v'ketuma. Umam meshahen, what food can we do shehiyah to? Beishamai omrim chamin avalo tavshel. Oh, food items, hot water, but not food. Or Beisil omrim chamin uva tavshel. You can do shehiyah across the board, both for water and for foods. The din chazara sheshanin bereisha, and now going back to the chazara that we mentioned earlier in the Mishnah, eino divrei hakol, and a machlokas beisham mesilal. It's not unanimous, but rather it's subject to a machlokas beisham mesilal. Shebeishamai omrim, the Beishamai say no klim avalo machzirin. You're allowed to take things off, but you mustn't put things back on. Or Beisil omrim af machazirim, and Beisil say that you can even do chazar. So you see that there's two different ways of interpreting the Mishnah. The Rabbanon say we're talking about Shehiyah and then we move to Chazara. But Chananya says no, the Reisha is talking about Chazara itself, but Shehiyah is fine, it doesn't need Gruf V'Ketuma so long as it is Maichel Ben Drusai. And then the Mishnah continues and says that when we refer to Chazara at the beginning, having left Chazara, spoken about Shehiyah, then it goes back to discuss Chazara. So those are the two interpretations of our Mishnah. That is the end of the first Mishnah of the third Perek, Shea Perek Kira.